G'day, welcome back. It's episode 50. So let's start off with a thank you to everyone who listens, watches, comments, shares this around, messages me privately and says thank you for what I'm doing. This has been an awesome journey so far. I'm learning a lot and I love engaging with everyone who enjoys this show. In today's news though, Iran, Israel and the USA have launched strikes which have killed Ayatollah Khamenei and several of his generals. The response in Australia has been mixed, but mostly on the side of the USA and Israel. We've heard from David Shoebridge, who has outed himself as a downright communist who hates Western society. We've heard from the Labor Party, who verbally touted that they agree with Israel's statements. And we've heard from the right wing of politics. Effectively, the news today is Iran. The people, how we should think about it, what is the potential fallout, and where we go from here. We'll get into all that and more on the Mark Pirotta Show.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Blaster! Welcome to the Mark Pirotta Show.
Before we get into the main topics for today, we're just going to look at two other stories. The first one is a tearjerker, so prepare yourself. It's a video that I missed from Dr. Joanna Howe, a video that brought all the feelings, every single one of them, and it really highlights from the perspective of a child, from the perspective of something so innocent, something that cannot defend itself, a child that is always dehumanized, that is told to be a clump of cells, that we are constantly informed has no rights, no value. And it is baby Samuel. It's the same baby that we've been speaking about now for 2 or 3 weeks. And it's a story that just refuses to go away. Dr. Joanna Howe is plowing the field with new information constantly about what actually happens in Australia when it comes to the treatment of children. Everything now ranging from abortion all the way to the way that children are treated and used within the surrogacy industry. Dr. Joanna Howe is the central source of information and truth when it comes to the abortion industry, specifically inside of Australia. But this video is really powerful because it highlights everything that we can assume, the empathy that we have for the child that cannot speak for themselves. The way that we are constantly told that we are terrible people for denying the rights of women to an abortion, where we see the rights of the child who screams silently from the womb. Watch.
I was traveling through Mummy and another lady grabbed me out and put me on a metal tray. It was cold and I didn't like it. But I felt okay because I still had my thumb. Another lady took me away into a different room. The new room had a big purple butterfly on the wall. It was beautiful. More ladies came to see me. One even took a photo. It was taking ages. I couldn't understand where Mummy has gone. At least they still had my thumb.
Baby Samuel died alone and uncared for in the butterfly room of a Queensland hospital, half an hour after being born alive following a failed abortion. This photo, passed on by a whistleblower in the hospital, shows him lying dead, his little thumb still in his mouth. Every year, between 40 to 50 Queensland newborns survive their abortion and are left to die.
Can't imagine it's easy to put something like this together. To do that voiceover and to make a video that so perfectly highlights the experience of what a child must go through. Now, just imagine yourself in those shoes for a moment. The way that they do that first person perspective, that you are the child who is taken, thrown into a metal plate, cold, freezing, so lost, so scared, and you don't even know why. No real concept of fear or death, just knowing that you are in agony. That the comfort that you felt for the better part of 20 weeks is now gone. that the womb that was supposed to support you and keep you safe was torn open by humans who are made to protect you and look after you, and that your final moments were spent in agony, desperately calling for the mother who did not want you. The last eyes you see are the nurse, who may be tearful, the doctor, likely indifferent, and instead of the loving embrace that a child is meant to feel upon exiting the womb, they are met with the cold reality that their existence is not recognized, that they are, for all intents and purposes, an unwanted being on this earth. The story of baby Samuel, I do believe, will be the tipping point of the abortion argument. I've said this multiple times before. Humans one day will look back on this period in human history, and they will wonder how we were so cruel as to take the littlest among us and treat them as nothing more than inconvenient objects, the byproduct of the pleasure that we pertain to be the most important part of our world today. Now, a completely separate note, as I mentioned last week, I was at a conference. And in that conference, I met a gentleman who has inside knowledge of the way that something completely out of left field, Indigenous traditional court systems work, punishments, how it is that the Indigenous communities, specifically in South Australia and the Northern Territory, created a system in which they effectively are able to take those who are criminals within the Australian justice system and create a mediation platform for them to migrate out of the court system, out of the prison system, and be treated under Indigenous justice. Now, for the longest time, we've been told that the Indigenous culture is something that is simply beautiful. It was almost a utopia, almost an otherworldly, inhuman, completely alien form of society that was simply beautiful with no problems and no issues. That the colonizer came and destroyed everything, and that unlike every other hunter-gatherer society, there was no conflict, no war, no fighting amongst each other. Their law was so perfect that it was superseded violence, that there was no ability for violence to happen because they were so in touch with the earth and the law and the way that the land worked. But this story that I heard from this person, who seems credible, let's put it that way, was one that even I could not have imagined could still be happening in Australia today. Relating in with the military forces of our country, this person has a friend, and that friend relayed a story to him that on multiple occasions he, as a paramedic, had to go and attend what was a ritual, law-based punishment within Indigenous culture. And effectively, the story goes like this. When a community deems that someone ought to be treated under Indigenous cultural law, a court system may, instead of punishing them under the Western systems, which is generally internment within a jail, the Indigenous community can claim that person and punish them under their own systems. And that on multiple occasions, this person reported that they both witnessed and treated individuals who fell under this categorization for multiple counts of leg spearing. When I was relayed this story, I could not believe it. I thought it was a lie. You've got to be kidding me. That's not real. Today in Australia, turns out it's not false at all. After a bit of Googling, the search history stops at about 2016, and that's effectively the exact same time that we started hearing all of the lies about how Indigenous culture was perfect and without blemish and without fault. But in 2016, there was an article that came out about an Indigenous community who wanted to take someone who was a murderer, or at least a manslaughterer under the Australian system, and treat them by spearing him 5 times in each leg under their own community law. Now, luckily, inside of that, we heard from the judge that the judge effectively said, no, he has to be treated under the Australian law for murder. And so he was given 15 years with a minimum parole period of 12 years. And in the court said that they cannot take the fact that they will be speared after they are released from jail into account, and that they still have to provide the maximum sentence allowed. Now, the question mark that I had when I first read this article was, holy hell, this is even worse than I thought. That's the first thing that popped into my head. So not only does the system know about this, that it is openly a topic of conversation within our justice system, that Indigenous communities will take someone and spear them in the legs, which, again, if you're talking simply from a human perspective, you would say he killed someone, he probably deserves more than that. But in our Western system, we don't allow for torture, scourging as a consequence of crime. We do internment, punishment, through jail time. That is the way that we effectively ensure that people do not fall back into a system where they can allow themselves to do something like this. Now, in reality, it doesn't tend to work that often. I agree. I think our justice system is too soft and it is not well managed. But the idea that we can go back to a primitive form of punishment where spearing in the legs seems to be the best way in order to ensure that someone will not do something again cannot be the solution. Not only can it not be the solution, it is illegal under our current system. And this is something that we've spoken about several times, and it's a really good legway into our actual topics for today. We really do have three systems of legislation at a minimum within our country today. We have our Australian legal system, which is the legal system that pertains to all of us regular folk. Inside of that, there's different tiers, obviously, based on the amount of money that you have and how good of a lawyer you can afford to take. We have the Indigenous system, which effectively still allows for people to be speared in the legs as part of their jurisprudence. And then we have Sharia law. And that is not hyperbolizing. In Australia today, we have Sharia courts, a court system which effectively allows Islamic communities, as isolated as they are, to effectively dole out their own forms of justice, their own legal systems. That is why, despite the fact that we're constantly told we are not allowed to have polygamy inside of our Australian system today, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of marriages that exist within this country between one man and multiple women. It exists because the Sharia court system exists outside of the law, in much the same way that the Indigenous system pretends to live outside of the law. These are court systems that do not function underneath the Australian government. They subvert it through the idea of some form, effectively, of sovereign citizenry. It is, as we said in last week's episode, Schrodinger's citizen. The notion that you can be both within the state and benefit from the state, effectively drawing down on the public tax-funded systems that exist inside of our semi-socialist nation. And simultaneously also break the law consistently and then claim some form of religious right to it. Now, Sharia law is the Muslim. And the Muslim law is effectively what the people of Iran have just rebelled against. Over the course of the last 3 to 6 months, we've seen protests erupting in the streets of Iran in a way that we've not seen for generations. There have been uprisings before, but this was bigger, larger, and more brutal than any other protest before. Something along the lines of 30,000 plus civilians were killed over the course of a week. I've often said this to friends and family that if people want to understand what a genocide truly looks like, it looks like 30,000 dead civilians over the course of a week. But that seems to be, at this stage, coming to an end, or at the very least, reaching its crescendo. That is, that it is reaching the highest peak of the danger for the Iranian people. The United States and Israel have taken action and have bombed Iran, hitting compounds, hitting military targets, and in doing so, they have eliminated Ali Khamenei, who was the supreme leader or Ayatollah of Iran. Now, in doing so, they also killed approximately 40 plus generals, and with new strikes, also killed the interim president, who was mandated as one of the people who would take over under a clear succession plan that was pre-ordered. Now, we have also heard that approximately 3 United States servicemen are dead. Approximately 150 Iranian schoolgirls or school children were killed in strikes, and whether that strike was from an Israeli bomb or an American bomb, or whether it was from a misfire from an Iranian missile, is yet to be known. At this stage, it seems far more likely that it is an Iranian misfire. The reason being is that there is a base quite literally 500 meters away from this school, a surface to air missile base quite literally 500 meters away from a school. Now, it is interesting to me that every single time that a large leader seems to die, a leader of some capacity seems to die within the Islamic world, almost inevitably there is some sort of school, generally a girls' school or a hospital, that is also bombed simultaneously. Now, whether this is a function of the fact that Muslims, as a general rule of thumb, like to build their bases very close to civilian areas in order to effectively give themselves cover so that if there is a 500-meter difference between where the bomb was meant to go to where it did go, they can blame the aggressor, or whether it is a consequence of the fact that every single time an Islamic leader dies, he has to be promised at least 72 virgins. Is it just me, or does it seem too much of a coincidence that it's almost always some sort of girls' school or girls' camp or hospital for women that always gets bombed when one of these large leaders actually dies? It seems almost uncanny, almost unbelievable, as though it's almost intentional. Was it an Iranian misfire, or was it a portion of the fact that Iran decided that the only way that they could retaliate was to ensure that Ali Khamenei had more than his necessary fill of 72 virgins upon his death? And while we're talking about questionable missile choices, why is it that almost every missile that has gone out has not been aimed at US ships, at Israel? Most of the missiles that we have heard about have effectively all hit the UAE, Kuwait, Dubai, Qatar. Why is Iran pointing their missiles at seemingly allies? People within the region who share the same Islamic ideology. And not at military bases, mind you, except for a very, very small few. Most of them have been pointed at entirely civilian infrastructure. We're talking about hotels, hospitals, airports. We're not speaking about the kind of thing that a normal military that is simply looking to defend itself, or at least simply pointing itself towards military targets, would do. And with that, we get to the Australian political reaction. Now, almost instantly, Anthony Albanese came out with a statement of support for the Iranian people, with little caveats of support for the US and Israel in completing this mission, in ending the regime that has so thoroughly tried to destabilize even our own political situation. Don't forget, it was not that long ago that we kicked out the Iranian ambassador from our nation. It was not that long ago that we listed the IRGC and its many plants also as terrorist organizations. That we effectively said the state of Iran is not congruent with our Australian state. And yet, despite that, David Shoebridge has come out with a statement that baffles the mind. When I heard this, I could not believe it. I thought for sure someone had taken over his body, his brain, and his mouth and just said things that would never come out of an Australian politician's mouth. But as it turns out, this is exactly how David Shoebridge feels. Let's watch this clip and then you see if you can find all that is wrong.
Everybody believes that Donald Trump is engaged in this war on the side of the Iranian people for democracy and human rights. Donald Trump isn't on the side of democracy and human rights in the United States, let alone in Iran. We saw Penny Wong today refuse to pass judgment on whether or not this wide-scale attack from both the United States and Israel was consistent with international law. That is a comprehensive failure from our own government. Anybody can see, who has the slightest understanding of international law, that this is an illegal attack by Israel and the United States. And international law doesn't enforce itself. International law needs players like Australia to back it in and to call it out when major regimes like the Trump regime repeatedly breach it. I know that there are people in the Iranian diaspora around the world desperate to see this regime changed in Iran. Desperate to see people in Iran safe and their human safety protected. But we know from history that US bombing, backed in by Australia and other sycophantic allies of the United States, do not produce human safety. They produce chaos, they produce violence, and they produce Western dominance, which is the intent behind this latest US attack.
So not only is David Shoebridge now pointing out that Australia and all of the allies of the US are sycophants for the US military. And sycophant basically means obsessed lover, as in to say that no matter what the US military does, we will always back them in. Not only is he saying that, he's also disparaging us all as Western nations, effectively saying that we want to dominate the world. But the question there is, what is the alternative? The Western world is the world that you live in. It's the world we live in. The alternative is an Islamic Eastern world. It is a communist world. It is socialist Russia, socialist China. It is communist Russia, communist China. It is North Korea. It is the Islamic Republic of Iran. It is everything that is wrong with today's world. We are speaking about the alternative between Western freedoms, democracies that were built, created, and then spread around the world by Western nations, or we are speaking about the theocracies, the communist dictatorships, and the brutal regimes that exist within Eastern nations. That's the only alternative. There is no middle ground utopia. You cannot have the perfect Eastern and the perfect Western living in amongst each other. The greatest hope that we have for this society is the Western world. And basically what David Shoebridge is saying is that he would prefer that it all be torn down for an alternative that only brings hate, prejudice, and the notion of peace that only exists for those who believe in the regime. We are not speaking about simply an act that ought to be censured. The things that David Shoebridge is saying is enough for an investigation for treason. David Shoebridge has not simply come out and said that he condemns America's actions, that he condemns Israel's actions. He has said and linked their exact actions with the notion of Western values and disparaged them within the same sentence. Western values are what allow you to have the freedoms that you have today. For you to come out and disparage every veteran, every patriot, every person who has ever served this country in any capacity as some sort of sycophant, as though they do not have the will or ability to see the difference between the USA and the IRGC, you have to be either traitorous treason or a moron. There is no in between on that. And I hope for your sake that you are simply a moron, because the alternative for you ought to be jail time. And if you are willing to say this sort of thing in public, an investigation into your personal files ought to be called for. Because at the end of the day, if you are willing to say this in public, God knows what you are willing to say in private. Unfortunately, making these sorts of little please do's is kind of essential. I enjoy doing it just for the fun of it, but at the same time, if you want to get a message out, you need the people in your community to just comment, like, subscribe, all of the normal jargon, right? Please just take a moment and give me a hand. We need to create a culture of commentary together. And I love the messages coming in my DMs. Put it in the comments section so that everyone else can see it too. Thank you. Now, while we're on the train of Islam within Australia, news came out and broke last week, big time, about large, not small, large terrorist rings, ISIS ideology-backed, let's put it that way. ISIS ideology-backed terror networks within Australia who are utilising applications such as Grindr and other homosexual applications in order to lure gays and homosexuals out into public to beat them mercilessly. If David Shoebridge and the rest of these radical leftists want to understand what a world under peaceful Islam looks like, you do not listen to what they say, you watch what they do. Because this is the result of the regimes that you love so much and the multiculturalism that you love so much coming to fruition inside of Australia. Watch.
Stop! دولة الإسلام بخير. لا إله إلا الله. لا إله إلا الله. Kill him. Kill the give us your money. Give us your money. Stop, give us your money.
You want to be gay? You want to be gay? Yeah?
لا إله إلا.
Now, this all came amidst news as well, which I found incredibly interesting at the end of last week. And I thought to myself, something big is happening here for two reasons. I managed, because I was driving for quite a while on Friday, to actually listen to an episode of Ben Shapiro, which I thought was cool. So I had half an inkling that something might happen on the Saturday, because he had a little bit of a Freudian slip on his episode where he said the next 48 hours is going to be really interesting, as though he had some sort of pre-informed knowledge that something might be happening, which, by the way, if anyone from America sees this, if Ben Shapiro knew about this and did not tell anyone, which is his right, he shouldn't be getting intel. At least make sure it's not coming from Israel. Make sure that that intel came from someone within the American agencies. Because however much I like Ben Shapiro, he is an American citizen and as such ought to ensure that the information he's getting, especially something as sensitive as this, is coming from the US and not from Israel, because that to me is a large conflict of interest. But the other reason that I thought something might be going on is because President Modi, the president of India, went to Israel and the fanfare was huge. The posting was next level. It almost felt like there was a large shift coming. It almost felt like a mask of a larger, much more, let's say, brutal attempt at ensuring regional peace. Because India, though many people may not know, is really the largest power within the region. They have hundreds of their own nuclear weapons. They are a superpower in their own right, simply based on the number of people that they have. And they are the largest and fastest growing country on Earth. They have outstripped China for several years now. And the way that President Modi went to Israel, and I want to say bent the knee, but more like shook the hand of Israel and said, you know what, we have been on the same path as each other now for thousands of years. We've been in each other's space for thousands of years. We were some of the first great civilizations on Earth. And within our region, we have been in each other's orbit for many, many years with almost no conflict between us and our peoples. We are, for all intents and purposes, I keep getting that wrong. We are, for all intents and purposes, some of the oldest living allies on Earth. And it was next level. I was watching some of the clips come out of it, and we'll just watch a little bit of the first speech that President Modi gave. Watch.
Honorable members, in India, there is a great admiration for Israel's resolve, courage, and achievements. Long before we related to each other as modern states, we were linked by ties that go back more than 2,000 years. The book of Esther refers to India as Hodu. The Talmud records trade with India in ancient times. Jewish merchants traveled across sea routes that connected the Mediterranean with the Indian Ocean. They came seeking opportunity and dignity.
This, to me, is one of the largest geopolitical shifts in world history. Up until maybe 12 months ago, India looked sure to make an alliance with Russia and China and Brazil and Iran as well, for that matter, in what was then called BRICS. It was effectively meant to be a hedge against the American dollar. It was supposed to be a combining of several different states to build a central banking system that worked off an Eastern center rather than the American dollar. Now, it started to fall apart during the Russia-Ukraine war when China started making moves on Taiwan and when many of the other conflicts started to pick up across the region, where the uniformity between communist allies and the people who create stuff, which is at this point India, started to really break down. And India decided to make their decision. They made the decision to join the West rather than to join the East. And it makes a lot of sense. India and China have been enemies for thousands of years. From the invasion of the Mongols and every single effectively dynasty since, there has been conflict between those two nations. They have been in a cold war between India and China for hundreds of years. And though many people do not know about it, the border between India and China is one of the most militarized borders outside of North and South Korea. And so this was, realistically, the most logical solution to the East-West problem. The hegemon of India that it will become, now joining forces with the US and with Israel and with all of the other allied powers in order to create and further the capitalist project, the conservative project, is something that has been really brewing now for quite a while. But it is a now geopolitical shift that almost no one saw coming. I reckon we keep our eyes on that partnership because now that the Middle East is flanked by Israel, by Europe, and by India, it becomes almost impossible for these nations to do anything without having the reasonable assumption that they will be trapped in by some of the greatest powers in the region. Now let's finish off with this clip. This clip was Anthony Albanese being given a microphone to speak effectively with no notes. Now, we saw what happens when Anthony Albanese speaks with notes, which was the Karl Stefanovic project, where Karl Stefanovic started off the interview really well, but then sort of got beat down for some reason into only doing softball questions after he really pushed him on the gas subject. And realistically, he was right to do so, to push him on gas, but he sort of flattened out after that. It's like he didn't exactly know how to, go at him really hard. And at the end of the day, Karl Stefanovic was never really an interviewer. He was sort of a morning show host. It's like everyone's just waking up out of bed. They just had their coffee. They're in the best mood they'll be in all day. They're not exhausted. And so, yeah, he's probably not that great at confrontation. He's done really well with the people on the right wing, but he copped a whole lot of flack for this interview. But this other interview that Anthony Albanese has done was, I'm not actually sure what the event was. I know that it was down in Melbourne and it went really poorly for him. Effectively, he was told, we're going to give you a name and you have to give us a single word response when we give you that name. Just something that pops to mind, the first word that pops into your head. And to say it went badly is an understatement. Watch.
Grace Tame.
Difficult.
One word answers if possible. Susan Lee.
Best wishes.
Andrew Mountbatten Windsor.
Grub.
One Nation voters.
Frustrated.
Pauline Hanson.
Divisive.
Australia Day. Australia Day.
Great.
Grace Tame.
Difficult.
Donald Trump.
President.
Barnaby Joyce.
I can't do that in one word.
Isis Brides.
Made their bed, they're lying in it.
Difficult. I mean, he's not wrong. Difficult is probably the nicest way that you can explain what Grace Tame has done over the course of the last 2 months. And to an extent, I feel bad for Grace Tame. Because Grace Tame had one thing. She was the star, realistically. She became who she was because she tackled one very specific issue, which was underreported sexual assault against women. She was a voice for people who had been legitimately victimized, she herself being one of those people. The problem is with youthful stardom, let's call it that, is you then get picked up by people as some sort of paragon. You get lifted up as a model in society and you are expected to comment on everything. It's a large issue with the media today and with our political class that they feel as though they need to have an opinion on quite literally everything. And so obviously she did not think this through deeply. What she effectively called for was an intifada, and that intifada, at least in history, by every element of evidence, is profuse with rape and sexual assault of women. Almost every time there is conflict, there is the rape and sexual assault of women. It is a consequence of war that has existed since the beginning of war. It's the reason that women are generally, or in days gone, or better days, they were left in the back lines. And so they would only be harmed, they would only be reached if the men failed at doing what they had tried to do, which is to defend their women and their children at home. And so for her to call for conflict is already step one of calling for the rape and sexual assault of women. Step two is that she's fighting for a movement which, in its own religious texts, says that women can be married and have intercourse with them as soon as puberty hits, which in Australia today, considering all of the crazy plastics and whatever hormones is in our food, is sometimes as young as 9 years old. And at least in the time of Muhammad, according to the Quran and several hadiths, it was 9 years old back then as well with his wife Aisha. The Islamic movement is not congruent with an anti-sexual assault and anti-rape movement because there are texts in there that say that you are allowed to do it. In fact, you're allowed to take sexual slaves in conflict inside of the Quran. It's part of their texts that you're allowed to have 4 wives and then you are allowed to have as many sexual slaves taken in conquest as you please. So this movement that she's decided to become the new spokesperson for is in no way congruent with the movement that she realistically first got famous for. And so, yes, she's difficult. I'd definitely say that. But his comments on One Nation supporters I thought were interesting because at least he's noticing that One Nation supporters aren't all just racists. And in a clip we'll share tomorrow, because I just saw it while my power went out, Lydia Thorpe has different ideas on Australians, but we're going to get into that tomorrow. Now, episodes this week are going to come out Tuesday and Wednesday, and then Friday and Saturday, as I have an unavoidable appointment on the Wednesday, so I won't be able to film for the Thursday show. That's going to do us for the show today. There's a lot more to talk about Iran, and I think I'm going to get a little bit more deep on the history, on the why this is happening now. Not just the reasoning that we're hearing today about why it is that the conflict started, but the reasoning behind why the people of Iran feel so disenfranchised in their own country. Maybe get a little bit deeper on the people who are currently representing us in politics and their takes on the situation and how it's very possible that we end up in a very similar situation here in Australia. With the way that the commentary is happening, with dark forces being touted by our own Prime Minister, with certain senators calling us effectively the deplorable statement for believing in a movement that effectively created this country, tried to go back to first principles, notions of how to build a society. We'll get into that tomorrow. For now, that'll do us for the show today. My name is Mark Pirotta. Please make sure you drop a comment if you have a thought. Please make sure you like it, share it with a friend. But whatever you do, make sure you get yourself involved in the political process. A more informed citizenry makes for a better democracy. At the end of the day, it is incumbent on us to ensure that our country's future is as bright as humanly possible, to ensure that the future for our children is as bright as humanly possible. That'll do us for the show today. My name is Mark Pirotta. It's the third time I've said it, and this is the Mark Pirotta Show. God bless.